All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Tara, and I'm the Garden Center Manager here at Alaska Mill and Feed. And it looks like everybody was able to hear me. There's a little chat box, and you can just type in questions there, or if you need me to speak up, you can also put something in there. If you could just keep your microphones muted and your videos off, this is going to be recorded, and then we'll be sending out the recording or the link for the recording to you probably early next week. And this class today is just going to be on planting seed potatoes and then the basic care of potato plants. I'm not going to go in depth on things like potato diseases, but I do provide resources for you so that you can find those things on your own. This is one of my favorite quotes about potatoes. What I say is that if a man really likes potatoes, he must be a pretty decent sort of fellow. And starting off with some potato fun facts. It's the fourth largest food crop in the world after wheat, corn, and rice. They were first cultivated by the Inca in what's now present-day Peru and far northwestern Bolivia about 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. And they were brought to Europe in the 1500s. They seem like they're pretty solid, but they're actually 80% water and 20% dry matter. And Europeans did not embrace the potato right away, and they were very suspicious of it. But Frederick the Great thought that it would be wonderful for his people to grow and would provide a lot of food for them, but they didn't want to. So he tricked his subjects into growing them by planting his own big fields, and then he put guards around them. And he instructed the guards to let people slip in and steal potatoes if they wanted to. And that's how people started growing them. Here's some basic potato plant botany. So on the left-hand side, you can see the potato plant. It starts out with the mother tuber, and then you can see the stolons. And those are the creeping horizontal stems or runners that they can take root and send up new plants, or they can form tubers at the end of the stolons as well. It goes up to the stem. And then there's the flowers. And flowers, you don't need the flowers at all in order to create tubers. They aren't really related that much. I'll touch on them a little bit further along, but we don't really need flowers if we're going to be making potatoes. And then when you cut into a potato, it can be really hard to see, but there is a vascular system inside one. And you can see where the bud and the eyes are going to be. I just thought it was pretty interesting. But we don't really need to know any of this in order to plant them. So here at Alaska Mill and Feed, we carry certified seed potatoes, and people often ask why you need to use certified seed potatoes. It's because our potato crop is free from many serious pests and diseases that are common in the continental United States and elsewhere in the world. If you use imported potatoes, they can introduce diseases. Even if the potato itself doesn't seem diseased, it can still introduce them. And using certified seed potatoes is a way to make sure that we don't bring any of those diseases into our state. You can use store-bought potatoes, but they don't comply with the standards that prevent the spread of agricultural diseases. And they're also usually treated with a spray that is a sprout suppressant. And so it can take several weeks for that to wear off. Just like tomatoes, potatoes come in determinate and indeterminate varieties. And then there's also like a in-between area where they don't fit quite into either one. Determinate potatoes, you can see in the drawing on the left-hand side, they grow in just one layer. So you don't need as much soil for them, and they don't require mounding. That's a pretty classic growing technique, is to mound soil up around the potato plant. And with determinate potatoes, you don't actually need to do that. They do tend to produce earlier. So if a variety says that it's an early producer, it's very likely it's a determinate variety. And they tend to be shorter plants with fewer flowers. Indeterminate varieties, the tubers grow in multiple layers, and they do need to be mounded, or they need to be planted deeply. Usually it's about 10 inches at least that they're growing in. And they do require a longer growing season, but because of that, they have the potential to give you more potatoes. And these are just examples of determinate and indeterminate potatoes that we carry here at the store. So the determinate varieties that I know of are the Red Norland, the Gold Rush, Kennebec, Norcota, the Red Chieftain, the Satina, and the Yukon Gold. Indeterminate varieties are German Butterball, Red Pontiac, French Fingerling, and Magic Mollies. These are not all of the potato varieties that we carry. We do have several more. It can be very difficult trying to track down and figure out which potatoes are determinate and indeterminate. I have yet to find a master list in my research. So I looked up most of them, and all the ones that I could find a definitive answer on, I listed here. And because we don't have time to go through every single potato, I've picked a few that I really like. One of my favorites that I grow every year is the German Butterball. It's a really good all-purpose potato, kind of a medium size, normal potato looking shape. They have really smooth skin, and their flesh is very flaky and kind of yellow. It's very buttery and tender, and they do store very well. And those are the indeterminate variety. The red Norlands, those are your pretty classic red potato. They've got the thin red skins and the white flesh. They mature very early. They are a fairly small, compact plant. So if you don't have a lot of room in your garden for potatoes, this would be a good plant to try to grow. But even though they're a small plant, they do have very large potatoes. They're great for boiling and roasting, and they have a moderate resistance to scab, which is a disease that I'll talk about a little bit later. Magic Myrna was developed here in Alaska by Bill Campbell. He was the former potato disease control specialist for the state of Alaska's Plant Materials Center. They're a fingerling potato, and they've got pinkish orange skin with sort of yellow blotches on them. The flesh is a pale yellow, very creamy and buttery, and they're a great potato for boiling, steaming, roasting, and sauteing. And they taste a little sweet too, but in a nice way. These are my very favorite potatoes. I grow these every single year. They're the Magic Mollies. They were also developed by Bill Campbell. I think that Molly was his daughter and Myrna was his wife. They're a fairly large size for fingerling potatoes. And then they have really gorgeous dark purple, almost black skin, and then a bright purple interior. And they just have an incredible flavor, especially when you roast them. That's how I usually cook them, is just roasting them in the oven. You don't get as many potatoes with them, but they do produce fairly large potatoes, and they do store very well. Before you plant your potatoes, it's a good idea to do something that's called chitting or pre-sprouting or green sprouting. And basically it's letting the eyes develop into little buds. And this gives your potatoes a 10 to 14 day head start. And it's pretty easy. You just take your seed potatoes out of cool storage about 4 weeks before you plant them. And we'll talk about the ideal time to plant them. You're going to place the potatoes on a tray. A tray lined with newspaper is great. And you want to do it at room temperature with moderate light, so about 65 to 70 degrees. And if you don't have time for this, or if you don't want to mess with this, it's a good idea to at least let your potatoes warm up a little bit, about 2 to 3 days before you plant them. You won't get, your potatoes will be a little bit delayed if you just plant a cold potato into the ground, because the ground's going to be cool as well. After you've chitted your potatoes, you can cut and cure them. So really small seed potatoes that are about 1 to 2 inches or less than 3 ounces, or if you don't want to weigh them, about the size of a small egg, they can be planted whole outside. So you don't need to bother with cutting them up. But if you have a larger one, then it's really economical to cut them up, and you can have several different potato plants from one potato. You want to make sure you sanitize your tools in between batches and have at least 2 eyes per piece. And so this is where the chitting comes in handy, is you can see the eyes a lot better after they've sprouted. Your pieces should be approximately 1.5 to 2 ounces, And you want to minimize your cut surface area, which basically means don't peel the whole potato. You want to leave as much of the peel intact as you can. You don't want to have a lot of the inner flesh exposed. You can cure your potatoes before you plant them, and that is what you're going to do is you store your cut seed potatoes at 50 to 60 degrees at 90% relative humidity for 3 to 4 days. You don't actually want to let the surfaces dry out. I know that that's what a lot of people do, is they let the cut surfaces dry, but that can let in infection. And curing is slightly different, and it requires a lot of humidity. I usually don't cure my cut potatoes because I cut them right before I'm going to plant them. One of the best ways to cure a potato piece like that is to stick it into warm, damp soil. And so it's just easier just to plant it. Ideal planting conditions. So you want to find a spot that gets full sun. A slightly acidic soil is desirable, but in reality, potatoes can be grown over a pretty wide range of pH levels. If you don't know what your pH is, or any of your what any of your elements are in your soil, your nitrogen, your potassium, and your phosphorus, then I would suggest getting a soil testing kit. At pH levels around 6, it's easier for a potato plant to use the important elements in the soil, like the nitrogen, the phosphorus, potassium. If the pH gets lower, then they have a harder time accessing those elements. Your soil doesn't need to be very rich, but it does need to be well drained. You can add in rotted manure, but it should be added the year before you plant it, and fresh manure should not be applied the year that you plant your potatoes. And this is because the bacteria that's in the manure can foster the growth of scab. You don't want to over-till your soil because it can destroy the soil structure. So if you're just starting out in a patch of ground, then definitely go ahead and till it to break it up a little bit. But if you already have an established garden and you have good soil, then just till the first couple of inches so that you can work in maybe some more compost. You can plant potatoes as soon as the ground is workable and the soil temperature is between 45 and 70 degrees. General rule of thumb is to wait until it's 50 degrees. The soil temperature is 50 degrees. Your soil should not be waterlogged. So even if your ground has thawed, if it's really soggy and you have standing water, then don't plant your potatoes yet. Wait until it dries out a little bit. In general, you can plant about 2 weeks before the last frost date. And Memorial Day weekend, June 1st-ish, is the traditional planting time here in Anchorage. And so it would be about mid-May that you could go ahead and plant your potatoes out. And new sprouts can tolerate air temperatures between 28 and 32 degrees. So as long as the soil temperature is about 50 degrees or a little bit warmer, your sprout should be fine. When you're planting potatoes in the ground, it's a good idea to keep crop rotation in mind. This lessens the spread and effects of diseases and pests. It can incorporate beneficial nutrients and bacteria into your soil and also create good soil structure. You don't want to plant a similar plant 2 years in a row. So you don't want to plant potatoes in the same spot 2 years in a row if you can help it. And you don't want to plant one of the other family members there as well. And so potatoes are related to tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. So you don't want to plant potatoes and then the next year put tomatoes there because they are susceptible to many of the same diseases. And so you can be easily spreading the disease to your tomato plants. A good way to think about it is beans, roots, greens, and fruits. So starting off with beans, beans are really great because they fix nitrogen into the soil and they can break up the soil a little bit to give you good soil structure. And then you can plant something that has roots that we harvest there. So carrots, radishes, potatoes. After those, the next year you could plant greens like kales, lettuce, spinach. And then after that, you can do your fruits, which is what the tomatoes, the peppers would be. And everybody has a different way of doing crop rotation. This is my way, but you are welcome to do it differently, as long as it works. If you're going to plant your potatoes directly in the ground, you want to dig a furrow that's about 4 to 5 inches deep and about 3 inches wide, and space the rows about 3 feet, 36 inches apart. Plant the pieces eyes up and 10 to 12 inches apart. If you forget about planting them eyes up, the potatoes, they'll figure it out. It might delay them by a couple of days or so, but you're still going to get potato plants coming up even if you plant the eyes down. You want to plant closer together for smaller potatoes. Like if you're going to harvest them for new potatoes, then plant your plants smaller together, but space them out wider for larger potatoes. And then the spacing also depends on variety. So you might want to look up and see what the spacing recommendations are for your varieties. Some of the potatoes, like the fingerlings, you can plant a little bit closer together. After you have them planted in your furrow, you're going to cover the pieces and continue to hill up the soil as the plants grow. And potato tubers mostly grow in the first 10 inches of soil, so you don't need to go up further than that. There are different ways to plant in the ground. That was a pretty traditional way to do it, but you can also plant them just 7 to 10 inches deep, and don't worry about hilling. It might take the sprouts a little bit longer to break the surface of the soil, but it's still going to do the same thing. It's just a little bit less work. You can plant as previously described with the furrows, but instead of hilling up with soil, you can use a really thick layer of straw. And you want to make sure that the straw is very thick enough to block out any light. And the straw is easier to move out of the way when you harvest, and it can cut down on damaged tubers because you're not having to dig into the soil as much. And it's also a very great mulch, and it will help retain moisture in your soil. You can plant in bags and containers. In order to do that, add 4 inches of soil to your container, place your potato pieces in them, and then add another 4 inches of soil, and then continue to add soil as the plant grows. This is effectively hilling them until the soil is about 10 inches deep. And a potato plant needs roughly 2.5 gallons to grow, and putting more plants in a container does not equal more potatoes. And so in one of those green grow bags like we sell here at the store, I would at max put in 3 potatoes that I'm planning to get plants from. I like to do it 2 because it gives my potatoes a little more space and I feel like I get a slightly better yield, but 3 should work too. And I would space them out like how the picture shows, kind of in a triangle shape, so they each have as much space as possible. Determinate varieties work really well in containers. You won't have to add as much soil in there, but you do want to make sure that your containers have adequate drainage and that you don't, potatoes don't like to sit in water for long periods of time. So you want to make sure that all that water is going to drain out. You want the soil moist, but you don't want them sitting in a puddle. And you won't get, you tend not to get as high of yields planting in bags and containers as you do planting in the ground. You'll still get a lot of potatoes, but you might get slightly more if you plant in the ground, just because the potatoes have more room to spread out. Fertilizing, it's always a good idea before you go to fertilize that you test your soil so you know exactly what you need to add in. I always recommend using a really good compost. I like the Susitna Organics compost a lot. And we have the Arctic Grow potato fertilizer. It's a 10-20-20. It's made specially for potatoes. It's really great. I think I recommend in every single class that you add mycorrhizal fungi to your soil. It can really help with potatoes because they're tubers, they're in the ground. It can help with the nutrients that they can absorb. You want to begin fertilizing 2 weeks after you plant, and you can spread your fertilizer into your soil following whatever the recommendations are for the fertilizer that you're using. And you don't need to till it in too deeply because you don't want to disturb any of the tubers that are growing there. And you also don't need to spread it out too far away from the plant because they tend to stick pretty close to their plant. So start 2 weeks after planting, apply the fertilizer every 4 weeks, and then stop fertilizing 2 weeks before the harvest. That's also when you're going to stop watering, and generally you water in fertilizer, so it will all work out. At the time of planting, you want to make sure you give enough water to moisten the soil. And then once the plants are taller than 6 inches, water about 1 inch a week. And try really hard not to get the leaves wet. You want to water at the base of the plant. Use drip irrigation if you have it. It's always a good idea. Or you can water in the morning so that the leaves dry throughout the day. And if you get the leaves wet, it's a good conduit for disease. So you want to try to make sure that the leaves can dry off quickly or that you're just not getting them wet to begin with. It's important to water enough when the plants are flowering because that's when they're really starting to produce tubers too. That's when the tubers are starting to bulk up. And then decrease the watering 2 weeks before you plan to harvest. The one disease that I am going to talk about is scab because it's the one I get the most questions about. Common scab, there are 2 different kinds that we tend to see, and one of them favors pH levels from 5.5 to 7.5. The other one likes pH levels below 5.5. So pretty much no matter what pH level you're at, there is going to be some kind of scab that likes it. So you can help manage this by growing resistant cultivars. There are some varieties of potatoes that are resistant to scab. You can look those up. And you want to maintain optimal moisture. It says optimal moisture when, I think just throughout the whole planting process, you want to make sure that you have optimal moisture and control soil pH. And that can be very tricky to do. So I would just, scab is pretty much always in the soil. It's just sort of a prevalent thing that's everywhere. It's just whether or not it decides to attack your potatoes. Make sure that you also rotate your crops every year. It's a really good idea to move your potatoes to different areas in your garden so that the scab isn't sort of building up in one spot. Even if you didn't have scab one year, if you plant in the same spot the next year, it's really likely that you will get some scab. And scab, you can still eat the potatoes, they just don't look great, but you can peel off those parts and still eat them. So you can harvest pretty much at any time. A new potato is just any early immature potato. So as soon as your potatoes start growing, you can start harvesting. You can check on your potatoes. If you have them in the ground, you can stick your hand in and sort of lightly dig around until you find one. If you've got one of those green grow bags, they usually have little like window panels in them so that you can open one up and look around in there. Before you harvest all of your potatoes, though, you want to stop watering the plants about 2 weeks before. You can cut the plants back at that point or just let them die back. I think it's a little bit tidier to cut them back, so that's usually what I do. I'm always worried about dead foliage attracting disease. In order to dig them up, a garden fork is probably the best tool to use, or you can use a shovel, but you want to start digging potatoes around about 10 inches out from the plant and just sort of dig straight down about another 10 inches or so and then gently start to pull up soil. You don't want to damage the tubers at all. And make sure you remove your potatoes from the ground before the ground freezes. Clean your potatoes off, just gently brush off the dirt. You don't need to brush off all of the dirt, and you don't want to spray them down with water. To cure them, place your potatoes on newspapers in a dark area with high humidity and temperatures around 70 degrees for 10 to 14 days. So if you've got a spare room that you can put them in or a warm basement, that will work well. And this just toughens them up so that They don't lose as much moisture when they're in storage, and they don't get as damaged. So green potatoes, they turn green because chlorophyll starts to develop when the potatoes are exposed to light. The green potatoes often have higher levels of solanine than other non-green potatoes. All potatoes and tomatoes and eggplants and everybody in the nightshade family, they do have small levels of solanine. It's a toxic chemical. It's found in all of those plants, but it's usually in very minute amounts. But it tends to get concentrated in green potatoes. In order to prevent this, keep your potatoes covered with soil as they're growing and keep harvested potatoes in the dark. So this is a good reason why to hill potatoes, potato plants, because you can keep the soil covered, or it's the soil covering the potatoes. You can also put down a mulch like the thick straw. If part of a potato is green, it is okay to cut that part off and eat the rest of the potato. But if a lot of the potato is green, then just go find a new potato and get rid of that one. To store your potatoes, only store potatoes that are in good condition. So if you accidentally hit one with your spade and it's bruised or has some broken skin, just clean that one up and eat it right away and don't store it. Your potatoes are not going to be in better condition by storing them. It will deteriorate their condition, so you want to start off with perfect potatoes. Store them in a cool, dark area like a basement, a garage, or an insulated shed. Up here, it's even nice if the shed is heated a little bit. You don't want them to freeze. If you've cured tubers, that they can be stored in a refrigerator at 40 degrees, but if they're uncured, if you put them in cold storage, then they lose too much moisture. And you don't want to let the temperatures get near freezing. There are some people who say not to put your potatoes in the refrigerator at all. I've had fairly good luck doing it, but I do like to store them better in a basement. I just feel like there's more airflow there. You don't get a lot of airflow in a refrigerator. Burlap bags are a good storage method because they block out light while letting the potatoes breathe. You can also use cardboard boxes, paper bags, mesh bags, and newspaper. You can wrap them up in newspaper. Those are all methods that work well. You just don't want to use plastic that doesn't have holes in it because that's not going to let the potatoes breathe. As long as it's dark, cool, and relatively humid, then you should have happy potatoes. And you can save potatoes for seeding next year's crop. So those would be your seed potatoes for the next year. You want to make sure that they're in very, very good condition before you plant them, because if they get dried out and wrinkly or slightly rotten, they can harbor diseases that you don't want to introduce into your soil. And if you have any doubts at all, then buy new certified seed potatoes. There are a lot of people who save potatoes to plant them and they don't have any problems at all. I personally buy new certified seed potatoes every year. And these are some resources. You can always email me or stop by and see me here at Alaska Mill and Feed. The UAF Cooperative Extension has a lot of publications on potatoes. These are just a few of the ones that I've listed. The Growing Potatoes in the Alaska Garden is really great. It's just a general how-to guide. They do have a short one on green potatoes. They have one on bacterial ring rot and then also on late blight. So those are good. Those are diseases that can affect your potatoes here in Alaska. And they tell you how to mitigate that and prevent it. One of my favorite gardening books is The Complete Book of Potatoes, What Every Grower and Gardener Needs to Know. It's a really great resource, maybe a little bit too sciencey and more in-depth than most people want to know about potatoes, but it's really great if you just need to look something up. And then recently, Larry Opperman wrote something for the Alaska Master Gardeners called A Passion for Growing Potatoes, which I thought was really good and had great tips on growing potatoes here in Alaska. And I just wanted to show you how easy it is to look up something on the cooperative extension. So you just go to their website. You can type in whatever it is that you're looking for. You can browse the publications. They have a lot of information. They don't have a location right now that you can go into, but you can call them or email them. You can send them pictures of plants, and they will help you with any plant problems that you might have. They're just a really great free resource. And now, if you've got any questions, I am happy to try to answer them. And if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat and I'll be able to see them. And if nobody has questions, then we can wrap it up. But I'll wait a couple of minutes. Is there any type that will grow well in shade? Most potatoes do fairly well in part shade. I don't know of any in particular that do well in full shade. So I would need to do a little bit more research on that one. I don't know which ones would do well in full shade. I'm sure that the plants would grow in full shade. You just might not get as many potatoes. We do have seed potatoes right now. They have been going fairly quickly, but we are getting shipments in about twice a week. I think that we just received some today. So you can call in and they'll tell you the varieties that we have. We aren't putting potatoes on hold, but you can purchase them over the phone if we have the varieties that you want, and then we will hold them for you for 24 hours. Do we just store them in a cool place till planting? Yes. So you just store them in a cool place. In the next couple of weeks, you can start chitting your potatoes. You want to put them in the same storage places that you would potatoes that you're storing to eat later. So a cool, dark, slightly humid place. I personally put my seed potatoes in the crisping drawer of my refrigerator, just because it's only going to be for a couple of weeks. I wrap them up in a paper bag and stick them in there because I know that they're not going to be in there for very long. How many seed potatoes do you suggest for a small garden to start? The plants can get fairly large. So if you're going to grow them in containers, then you would only need a couple of them. We're selling them in 5-pound bags. So you really don't need very many seed potatoes because each potato, if it's a larger potato, you can get multiple plants from it. So I would say maybe 5 to 10 potatoes, and that would be kind of on the larger side of, like, it'd be a fairly high number of plants that you could get from it. So if a 5-pound bag is a little too big for you, then you can split them with neighbors. That's what a lot of us here at the store are doing. All right, so it doesn't look like there's any more questions. So we'll go ahead and end here. If you do think of any, you can go ahead and email me. You can call the store. I'll be here all weekend. Yep, the copy of the slides is going to be sent out later. This is recorded, and so they'll post a link and they'll send you the website that you can go to. All right, thank you, everybody.